The notification arrived at exactly 12:01 a.m. on March 15th, lighting up my phone screen in the darkness of my Tempe apartment. Trust distribution complete. Purse $850,000. 00 has been deposited to your account. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the weight of my grandfather's love reaching across time to change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours earlier, my sister Sofia had stood in Maricopa County Family Court, perfectly manicured nails tapping against the defendant's table, rolling her eyes at what she called my pathetic promises and delusional fantasies about some magical inheritance. Her lawyer had smirked when I mentioned the trust fund, suggesting to Judge Williams that I was living in a fantasy world and making up stories to avoid my family obligations. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 6 months, my own parents had dragged me through legal hell, demanding I sign over rights to money that technically didn't even exist yet. Money that Sofia insisted was probably just a few $1,000s that Grandpa Tony was too embarrassed to admit. Money that my father Miguel claimed should be shared equally because that's what family does. Money that my mother Carmen said I had no right to hoard while my sister struggled with debt. But Grandpa Tony Rodriguez had been very specific in his trust documents. The $850,000 from the sale of Rodriguez Construction Company would mature on my 28th birthday. Not a day earlier. Not for anyone else. Just me. The morning that changed everything started like any other Wednesday in Phoenix. The desert air was already warm by 7 a.m., promising another scorching March day that would hit 95 degrees by noon. I sat on the small balcony of my one-bedroom apartment, drinking coffee from a chipped mug and watching the sunrise paint Camelback Mountain in shades of rose and gold. In a few hours I'd be 28. In a few hours everything would be different. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother Elena. "Happy birthday, Mia. Your grandfather would be so proud. Don't let them steal what he worked so hard to give you." I smiled, remembering how Elena had been the only one to support me when this whole nightmare began 6 months ago. She knew what Grandpa Tony's construction business had meant to him, how he'd built it from nothing in the 1970s when he first immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination and a toolbox. The business had thrived for decades, specializing in custom homes throughout Scottsdale and Paradise Valley. Tony Rodriguez became a name people trusted, a man whose handshake was worth more than most contracts. When he sold the company in 2017, a year before his death, he was clear about his intentions for the money. "Emma works harder than anyone I know," he'd told my grandmother. "She reminds me of myself at her age. The money goes to her when she's old enough to handle it responsibly." What Grandpa Tony hadn't anticipated was how his decision would tear his family apart. Sofia had always been the golden child in our household. 3 years younger than me, she possessed an effortless charm that seemed to smooth over every mistake, every missed deadline, every poor decision. While I was working part-time jobs throughout high school to save for college, Sofia was getting her nails done and planning her quinceañera party that cost more than my first car. When I graduated from Arizona State with a business degree and landed a marketing position at a growing tech startup, Sofia dropped out of University of Arizona after 2 semesters, claiming the professors didn't understand her creative vision. Our parents Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez ran a successful landscaping business that serviced many of the same wealthy Scottsdale neighborhoods where Grandpa Tony had built homes. They'd worked hard to maintain an upper-middle-class lifestyle, ensuring both their daughters had opportunities they'd never had. But somewhere along the way, they'd developed 2 very different sets of expectations for their children. From me, they expected responsibility, independence, and success. When I struggled to afford textbooks during my sophomore year, my father suggested I work more hours rather than offering help. When I graduated college with honors, their congratulations came with immediate questions about my salary and when I'd be moving out. When I found my apartment in Tempe and furnished it with second-hand finds and careful budgeting, they praised my practical approach to life. For Sofia, the rules were different. When she accumulated $15,000 in credit card debt during her brief college stint, they quietly paid it off. When she decided to become a lifestyle influencer, they funded her ring light setup and professional photography sessions. When she crashed her BMW last year while texting and driving, they replaced it with a newer model, citing her emotional trauma from the accident. The disparity wasn't lost on me, but I'd made peace with it years ago. Some children are raised to be independent, others are raised to be dependent. I'd learned to take pride in my self-sufficiency, even when it sometimes felt lonely. Then Grandpa Tony died, and everything shifted. The reading of his will had been straightforward. The house went to Grandma Elena. Small amounts went to various relatives. But the bulk of his wealth, the $850,000 from Rodriguez Construction Company, was placed in an irrevocable trust for me, to be distributed on my 28th birthday. The lawyer explained that the trust couldn't be changed, contested, or accessed early under any circumstances. Sofia's reaction was immediate and volcanic. "That's not fair," she'd shouted in the lawyer's office. "Emma already has a good job. I'm the one who needs help." She'd turned to our parents, tears streaming, demanding they do something about this obvious mistake. Our parents' response surprised me. Instead of explaining that Grandpa Tony had been clear about his intentions, they began questioning whether the decision was fair. "Maybe there's a way to split it," Mom had suggested tentatively. "Family should share blessings."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"The trust is ironclad," the lawyer had repeated. Mr. Rodriguez was very specific about his wishes. But that didn't stop them from trying. For months after the funeral, family gatherings became tense affairs. Sofia would make passive-aggressive comments about some people getting everything handed to them, while pointedly struggling to pay for dinner. My parents would suggest that perhaps I could voluntarily share the inheritance when it matured. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria began treating me differently, as if my impending windfall had somehow made me less deserving of their warmth. The only person who remained steadfast was Grandma Elena. Tony knew what he was doing. She'd tell anyone who'd listen. Emma earned this through her character, not her need. I tried to stay above the fray, focusing on my work and counting down the days until my birthday. But as the months wore on, Sofia's debt problems grew worse. She'd racked up another $30,000 in credit card debt, this time funding a failed attempt to launch her own jewelry line. She'd moved back in with our parents, claiming she couldn't afford rent. And most concerning, she'd begun making increasingly desperate posts on social media about family betrayal and financial hardship. 3 months before my birthday, Sofia discovered she was pregnant. The father, according to her tearful confession to our parents, was a married man who'd blocked her number when she told him the news. Suddenly her need for financial security became more urgent, and my trust fund became the target of renewed family pressure. "She's going to be a single mother," Mom had pleaded during a particularly difficult family dinner. "Emma, you're successful and stable. Sofia needs this money more than you do. She's carrying your nephew or niece," Dad had added. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I'd felt the familiar weight of family guilt settling on my shoulders. But I also remembered Grandpa Tony's words from years earlier, when I'd been struggling to afford my last semester of college and had briefly considered dropping out. "Mija," he'd said, "the world will always tell you to give up what's yours for someone else's convenience. Don't let them. What you earn, what you build, what you sacrifice for, that's yours to keep." So I held firm. "The trust can't be changed," I repeated. "Even if I wanted to share it, legally I can't access it until my birthday." That's when things got ugly. Sofia, now 4 months pregnant and increasingly desperate, convinced our parents to consult a lawyer about challenging the trust. When they learned it was indeed unbreakable, they shifted tactics. If they couldn't change the trust, they'd change me. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, delivered by a courier who seemed apologetic about the whole affair. Miguel Rodriguez and Carmen Rodriguez versus Emma Rodriguez, the heading read, "Petition for court-ordered family financial mediation and equitable distribution of assets." The basic argument was audacious in its simplicity. My parents claimed that while they couldn't access the trust directly, they could petition the court to order me to voluntarily redistribute the money once I received it. They cited Sofia's pregnancy, her debt, and her vulnerable position as evidence that keeping the inheritance would constitute unjust enrichment and willful neglect of family obligations. The petition included character statements from Sofia, Uncle Carlos, and Aunt Maria, all describing me as selfish, ungrateful, and forgetting where I came from. Sofia's statement was particularly stinging, claiming I had always been jealous of her popularity and was using Grandpa's money to hurt the family. But the most painful part was reading my parents' sworn statement. They detailed every expense they'd incurred raising me, from baby formula to college application fees. They claimed that because they'd invested in my education and success, they had a right to expect returns on that investment. The trust fund, they argued, was partially theirs by virtue of having created the person capable of inheriting it. I read the documents twice, then called Grandma Elena. Mija, she said, after I'd explained the situation, your grandfather saw this coming. Why do you think he made the trust irrevocable? What do you mean? He knew Sofia was his son's favorite. He knew Miguel and Carmen would pressure you to share. He wanted to make sure you couldn't give in to guilt, even if you wanted to. So what do? You fight. Not just for the money, but for the principle. Your grandfather believed in rewarding character over need. Don't let them convince you that success is something to be ashamed of. The next morning, I hired a lawyer. Jennifer Chen was a family law attorney with a reputation for handling complex inheritance disputes. She reviewed my case and gave me her assessment. This is a nuisance lawsuit designed to intimidate you into settling. There's no legal basis for forcing you to share an inheritance, regardless of family circumstances. But be prepared, these cases can get very personal. She wasn't kidding. Sofia launched a social media campaign almost immediately. Instagram posts with crying selfies and captions about family betrayal and blood money. TikTok videos explaining how her rich sister was abandoning her pregnant sister out of greed. Facebook posts detailing our grandfather's supposed mental decline in his final years and questioning whether he'd been manipulated into changing his will. The comments poured in from strangers who only knew Sofia's version of events. Your sister is evil. Money really does corrupt people. I can't believe someone would steal from their own family. Each notification felt like a small dagger, particularly because I couldn't defend myself without violating my lawyer's advice to avoid public statements. The worst part was seeing how the campaign affected my relationships. Colleagues at work began treating me differently after Sofia's posts went viral in our local community. Neighbors in my apartment complex whispered when I passed. Even some of my college friends reached out with concerned messages, asking if I was really doing this to my pregnant sister. Meanwhile, my parents doubled down on their legal strategy. They hired Robert Klein, a lawyer known for taking controversial family cases that generated media attention. Klein immediately filed for an emergency hearing, claiming Sofia's pregnancy constituted a time-sensitive situation requiring immediate resolution. The emergency hearing was scheduled for a week before my birthday. Klein argued that waiting until the trust matured would cause irreparable harm to Sofia and her unborn child. He presented medical bills, debt statements, and a detailed budget showing Sofia's projected expenses as single mother. He even brought in Sofia herself, now visibly pregnant and dressed in a simple black dress that emphasized her condition. Your Honor, Klein had said, we're not asking the court to break the trust. We're asking for basic human decency. Emma Rodriguez has the power to solve her sister's crisis with money she hasn't even earned yet. Money that represents her grandfather's love for his entire family, not just one granddaughter. Sofia had taken the stand next, dabbing her eyes with tissues as she described her desperate situation and her heartbreak over her sister's coldness. I just don't understand, she'd whispered into the microphone. We used to be so close. All I'm asking for is help during the most vulnerable time of my life. Judge Williams had listened patiently, then turned to my lawyer. Does your client wish to respond? Jennifer Chen had stood confidently. Your Honor, this is exactly the scenario the grantor wanted to prevent when he created an irrevocable trust. The plaintiffs are asking this court to pressure my client into giving away money she legally inherits in 3 days. There is no legal precedent for compelling charitable distributions of inherited assets, regardless of the recipient's emotional appeal. The judge had ruled against the emergency petition, but scheduled a full hearing for 2 days after my birthday, when the trust would have already matured. If there are legitimate claims about family obligations, Judge Williams had said, we'll address them when the inheritance is actually in question. Those were the longest 3 days of my life. Sofia ramped up her social media campaign, posting hourly updates about her anxiety over the impending betrayal. My parents stopped speaking to me entirely. Uncle Carlos left a voicemail saying I was a disgrace to the Rodriguez name. But Grandma Elena stayed strong. 3 more days, Mia, she'd remind me each evening. Then this is over. The morning of March 15th, I woke up to my phone buzzing with birthday wishes from friends who had stayed loyal throughout the ordeal. I made coffee, sat on my balcony, and watched the sun rise over the desert, knowing this would be the last morning of my life, when money was a constant worry. At noon I checked my bank account and saw the number that changed everything. $850,000. 00. I screenshotted the balance and sent it to Grandma Elena with a message, "Thank you for believing in me." Her response came immediately. "Thank your grandfather, and don't let them guilt you into thinking you don't deserve this." 2 days later, I walked into Maricopa County Family Court for what I hoped would be the final hearing in this ridiculous case. Sofia was already there with our parents, wearing the same black dress and victim expression she'd perfected over the past months. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria sat behind them, shooting daggers with their eyes as I took my seat at the defendant's table. This time the courtroom was fuller. Sofia's social media campaign had attracted attention from local news outlets and curious observers who wanted to see how this family drama would unfold. I felt exposed, judged, but also strangely calm. The money was mine now. Legally irrevocably mine. Judge Williams called the session to order and asked Klein to present his case. What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as legal argument. Klein painted me as a cold, calculating woman who had manipulated a dying old man into leaving her money that rightfully belonged to the entire family. He suggested that Grandpa Tony's trust was evidence of diminished capacity and undue influence. He brought out poster boards showing Sofia's debt, her medical expenses, and projected costs of raising a child alone. He presented character witnesses who testified about my selfishness and Sofia's generous spirit. He even submitted social media posts from concerned community members questioning my character. The climax came when Sofia took the stand again. This time she didn't hold back. She accused me of being jealous of her entire life, of poisoning Grandpa Tony against the rest of the family, and of stealing money that should help her raise her child. She claimed I had made empty promises about helping her once the money came through, promises she said I had no intention of keeping. "She sits there acting like she's innocent," Sofia said, pointing directly at me, "but she's been planning this for years. She turned our grandfather against his own family because she couldn't stand that people actually liked me better." Then came the moment that would haunt her forever. Klein asked Sofia what she thought should happen to the money. "It should be split equally," Sofia said firmly. "Half for me, half for her. That's what families do, and if your sister refuses." Sofia's mask slipped completely. She laughed, actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the courtroom. "What's she going to do with all that money anyway? She lives in a crappy apartment and drives a 10-year-old Honda. She doesn't even know how to enjoy life. At least I could put it to good use." Judge Williams leaned forward. "Miss Rodriguez, are you saying your sister doesn't deserve the inheritance because she lives modestly?" Sofia, realizing her mistake too late, tried to backtrack. "I'm saying she doesn't need it like I do. She has a job. She has stability. I have nothing. You have a family willing to sue for you." Judge Williams observed dryly. The judge then turned to me. "Miss Rodriguez, would you like to respond to these allegations?" I stood slowly, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Your Honor, my grandfather built Rodriguez Construction from nothing. He understood the value of hard work, personal responsibility, and earning what you receive. He didn't leave me this money because I was his favorite. He left it to me because he believed I would honor his values." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared. "These are bank statements showing every dollar I've earned and saved since I started working at 16. These are my college transcripts showing I graduated with honors while working part-time jobs. These are receipts for every bill I've paid, every piece of furniture I've bought, every milestone I've achieved without asking my family for help." I handed the folder to the judge. "Sofia claims I made empty promises about sharing this money. The truth is, I never made any promises at all. Because I knew from the beginning that this inheritance wasn't mine to give away, it was my grandfather's final gift to someone he believed embodied his values." Judge Williams reviewed my documents in silence. When she looked up, her expression had shifted. "Mr. Klein, does your client have any documentation of these alleged promises?" Klein fumbled through his papers. "Your Honor, family promises aren't always documented." "That's a no," Judge Williams interrupted. She turned back to me. "Miss Rodriguez, you mentioned your grandfather's values. Can you elaborate?" "He believed that character matters more than circumstances. That work matters more than excuses. That earning something yourself gives it more value than having it handed to you." I paused, looking directly at Sofia. "He also believed that people who expect others to solve their problems will never learn to solve them themselves." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Sofia's face had gone red, our parents looked stunned, and even Klein seemed to realize his case was falling apart. Judge Williams made her ruling swift and decisive. This court finds no legal basis for compelling Miss Emma Rodriguez to share her lawfully inherited assets. The trust document is clear, the inheritance process was proper, and there is no evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity on the part of the grantor. She paused, looking directly at my family. Furthermore, this court is troubled by the attempt to use legal proceedings to pressure a family member into relinquishing assets they legally inherit. Inheritance law exists to honor the wishes of the deceased, not to redistribute wealth according to the perceived needs of the living. Case dismissed. As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Sofia burst into tears, our parents looked shell-shocked, and Uncle Carlos muttered something under his breath about the family being destroyed. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Outside the courthouse, Sofia made one final attempt at manipulation. "Emma, please," she said, grabbing my arm as I walked toward my car. "I'm sorry about what I said in there. I was just scared. Can't we work something out?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw someone I barely recognized. The sister I'd grown up with had been replaced by someone who viewed every relationship as a transaction, every emotion as a tool for getting what she wanted. "Sofia," I said gently, "Grandpa Tony didn't leave you money because he wanted you to learn that you can solve your own problems. He left me money because he believed I already had." 3 months later, I moved into a beautiful 2-bedroom house in Ahwatukee, a quiet suburb south of Phoenix. I paid cash, eliminating the stress of mortgage payments and leaving me with enough left over to invest for my future. Sofia, meanwhile, had the baby, a healthy girl she named Isabella, and moved in with the baby's father, who had left his wife after all. Our parents eventually apologized, awkwardly and incompletely, but enough to maintain minimal contact. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria never spoke to me again, but I learned from Grandma Elena that Carlos had asked our father for a loan to cover some business debts shortly after the court case ended. Apparently, the family's attitude toward sharing the wealth was more situational than I'd realized. The most surprising development came 6 months after the inheritance, when Sofia reached out through Grandma Elena asking to meet for coffee. Curious, I agreed. She looked different, more tired, but also more grounded. Motherhood had apparently forced her to confront some realities that social media couldn't filter away. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble. "Not just for the lawsuit, but for everything. I spent so many years expecting other people to solve my problems that I never learned how to solve them myself. And now I'm learning." She showed me photos of Isabella, talked about her new job as a dental receptionist, mentioned she was taking online courses in business administration. "I'm not saying I'm grateful you didn't give me the money," she continued, "but I think I understand why Grandpa Tony made the choice he did. Oh, he knew I needed to figure out who I was when nobody was fixing my problems for me." She paused. "Turns out, I'm stronger than I thought. We didn't become best friends overnight, but we began rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Sofia never asked me for money again, and I never offered. But when Isabella turned 1, I set up a small college fund for her, not out of guilt, but because I wanted my niece to understand that education is something you invest in, not something you assume others will provide. As for Grandpa Tony's money, I invested most of it conservatively, using the income to supplement my salary and build a foundation for long-term financial security. I also donated $50,000 to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, particularly those studying business or trades. The plaque reads, "In honor of Antonio Rodriguez, who believed character creates wealth, not the other way around." Sometimes I think about that moment in the courtroom, when Sofia laughed at my empty promises, dismissing my potential because I lived modestly and drove an old car. She couldn't understand that choosing to live below your means isn't poverty, it's power. It's the power to make decisions based on values rather than desperation, principles rather than pressure. Grandpa Tony had understood that power, and he'd passed it on to someone he believed would use it wisely. Not because I was perfect, but because I'd proven I could build something without tearing others down, succeed without demanding that others fail. The trust fund didn't just mature on my 28th birthday. It matured me, forcing me to defend not just money, but the values that had earned it. In the end, Sofia had been right about one thing: I did get everything handed to me. But what she never understood was that everything I received, I'd already proven I deserved. And that made all the difference. The weeks following Judge Williams' initial ruling should have brought relief, but instead they ushered in a campaign of psychological warfare that tested every boundary I'd ever tried to maintain with my family. Sofia's public humiliation in court had only fueled her determination to paint herself as the victim of a cold, calculating sister who valued money over blood. Within hours of leaving the courthouse, Sofia had transformed her social media presence into a full-time sympathy operation. Her Instagram stories became a daily documentary of struggle, featuring tearful selfies in baby stores she couldn't afford, screenshots of overdue bills, and carefully staged photos of her growing belly, accompanied by captions about facing single motherhood alone, while my wealthy sister watches from her ivory tower. The most insidious part was how she weaved just enough truth into her narrative to make it believable. Yes, I had inherited $850,000. Yes, she was pregnant and struggling financially. Yes, our grandfather had chosen to leave everything to one granddaughter instead of dividing it equally. What Sofia omitted were the decades of context that explained those choices, the years of her entitlement and my self-reliance that had shaped Grandpa Tony's decision. Her TikTok account, which had previously featured lifestyle content and failed product promotions, became a platform for exposing toxic family dynamics and financial abuse. Videos of her crying while opening past due notices garnered hundreds of thousands of views. Her most viral post showed her standing outside my apartment complex, claiming she'd come to beg her sister for help, only to be turned away like a stranger. The truth was that Sofia had never come to my apartment. The video had been filmed in the parking lot of a similar complex across town, but her followers didn't know that. The comments section became a Greek chorus of outrage directed at me. Imagine being so heartless you'd let your pregnant sister become homeless. Rich people really think they're better than everyone else. This is why I don't trust anyone with money. Someone needs to dox this Emma girl and show her what real consequences look like. That last comment sent a chill down my spine, especially when I noticed it had received over 1,000 likes. I'd been careful to keep my personal information private, but Sofia's videos included enough details about my location and workplace that determined strangers could probably find me if they wanted to. My parents had initially seemed embarrassed by the court proceedings, retreating into wounded silence that I'd interpreted as shame over their failed legal gambit. I was wrong. Their quiet wasn't remorse, it was strategic planning. 2 weeks after the hearing, Dad called me for the first time since my birthday. His voice carried a weariness
That immediately put me on guard. Emma, we need to talk about Sofia. What about her? She's not doing well. The stress of everything, the pregnancy, the debt, your mother and I are worried about her mental health. I felt the familiar tug of family guilt, even as I recognized the manipulation. Dad, I'm sorry she's struggling. But the court already ruled. This isn't about the court ruling, he interrupted. This is about basic human decency. She's your sister, Emma. She's carrying your niece or nephew. Doesn't that mean anything to you? The conversation followed a script I was beginning to recognize. Dad would establish Sofia's vulnerability, emphasize family bonds, then gradually escalate to accusations about my character. This time, he added a new element. Dr. Martinez is concerned about her stress levels affecting the baby. High-risk pregnancies run in your mother's family, you know. If something happens to that child, because Sofia couldn't afford proper prenatal care, he let the implication hang in the air like a threat. If the baby suffered health problems, it would be my fault for refusing to pay for better medical coverage. Dad, Sofia has health insurance through the state. She's getting prenatal care. Bare minimum care, he corrected. Not the kind of attention she'd receive if she could afford private doctors, specialists, the kind of care your money could provide. The conversation continued for 40 minutes, with Dad systematically attacking every defense I tried to raise. When I mentioned Sofia's history of financial irresponsibility, he countered that pregnancy had changed her priorities. When I pointed out that Grandpa Tony had specifically chosen me as the beneficiary, he suggested that our grandfather had been influenced by his grief over Grandma Elena's illness, and hadn't been thinking clearly. He was 93 years old, Emma. People that age don't always make rational decisions. He was sharp until the day he died, and you know it, sharp enough to cut his own son's children out of his will. Sharp enough to leave everything to the granddaughter who visited him twice a year instead of the one who called him every week. That was news to me. Sofia had never mentioned regular contact with Grandpa Tony, and Grandma Elena had never mentioned it either. But even if it were true, it didn't change the legal reality of the inheritance. The call ended with Dad's voice, taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold and calculating in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his business negotiations. You have a choice to make, Emma. You can be the kind of person who helps family when they need it, or you can be the kind of person who watches them suffer while sitting on money you didn't earn. But understand that choices have consequences, and some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. The next phase of their campaign became clear a few days later, when my phone started ringing with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Distant cousins, family friends, even people I barely remembered from childhood gatherings, reached out with remarkably similar messages. I heard about Sofia's situation. Such a shame when family can't help family. Your grandfather would be heartbroken to see the family fighting over money. Maybe there's a way to work something out, for the sake of the baby. The coordination was obvious, but effective. Each caller presented themselves as a neutral party, concerned about family unity, but their talking points were identical. Sofia was vulnerable. I was being selfish. Grandpa Tony would have wanted me to share. Family obligations trumped legal rights. The most painful call came from my cousin Diego, Carlos and Maria's son, who had been like a brother to me growing up. Diego was 2 years older than me, married with twin boys, working as an electrician for a company that often subcontracted with my parents' landscaping business. Emma, he said, his voice careful and measured. I'm not trying to tell you what to do with your money, but I wanted you to know that Sofia came to our house last night. What happened? She was crying, talking about being evicted from her apartment. Said she'd been too proud to ask for help until now, but the baby's health was more important than her pride. Diego paused. She asked if Maria and I could lend her $5,000 for a security deposit on a new place. We don't have that kind of money lying around, Emma. Our own mortgage is tight, especially with the boys needing daycare. But seeing her like that, he trailed off, then continued with obvious reluctance. She mentioned that her sister had inherited almost $1 million but wouldn't help her even though she's pregnant. The picture became clear. Sofia wasn't just running a social media campaign. She was personally visiting family members, playing the desperate pregnant woman, asking for help while making sure everyone knew that her wealthy sister could solve all her problems but chose not to. Diego, did she tell you why Grandpa Tony left the money to me specifically? She said it was because you were always his favorite, and that he didn't really understand her artistic spirit. Another pause. Emma, is that true? Because it doesn't sound like the Grandpa Tony I remember. I spent an hour on the phone with Diego, explaining the real history. Sofia's dropped college courses, her mounting debts, her pattern of expecting others to solve her problems. I told him about Grandpa Tony's construction business, his belief in personal responsibility, his specific instructions about the trust fund. By the end of the conversation, Diego's tone had shifted. Damn, Emma. I'm sorry. Sofia made it sound like you'd just gotten lucky and were being greedy about sharing. She's very good at controlling narratives. Well, for what it's worth, I don't think you owe anyone your inheritance. But he hesitated. You should know that not everyone is going to want to hear the whole story. Some people prefer the simple version where someone rich helps someone poor. Diego was right. Over the following weeks, I watched my extended family split into factions. Those who knew me well, who remembered my work ethic and Sofia's entitlement, quietly supported my position. But others, particularly those who had their own financial struggles, seemed to view my inheritance as a kind of lottery winnings that should be shared with anyone in need. The pressure campaign intensified when Sofia announced she'd been evicted from her apartment and would be moving back in with our parents. Her social media posts about being forced to move home painted a picture of a young woman with nowhere else to turn, conveniently omitting that she'd been living rent-free with friends since dropping out of college and had only gotten her own apartment 6 months earlier, using money from a credit card cash advance. Mom called me the day after Sofia moved in, her voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. Emma, this can't continue. Having Sofia here, pregnant and stressed, it's affecting everyone. Your father isn't sleeping. I'm getting pressure from my book club about our family drama. People are starting to take sides. Mom, I didn't create this situation. You're the only one who can end it, she interrupted. You have the power to fix everything, but you're choosing to let it continue. The money isn't mine to give away, even if I wanted to. Grandpa Tony left it to me for specific reasons. Your grandfather is dead, Emma. The living matter more than the dead. The bluntness of that statement took my breath away. Mom had always been the more diplomatic parent, the one who smoothed over conflicts and avoided direct confrontation. Hearing her dismiss Grandpa Tony's wishes so casually revealed how completely the family had rallied around Sofia's narrative. Mom, do you really believe I don't deserve this inheritance? A long pause. I believe families should take care of each other. I believe when one person has abundance and another has nothing, sharing isn't just nice. It's necessary. And what do you believe Sofia has learned from a lifetime of people solving her problems for her? I believe she's learned that family is supposed to be there for each other. Something you apparently missed. The conversation ended badly, with Mom hanging up after I refused to commit to finding a solution for Sofia's situation. That night, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by the modest life I'd built through careful planning and hard work, feeling more isolated than I had since moving out of my parents' house. But isolation turned to genuine concern when Grandma Elena called me the next morning, her voice shaky in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. Mija, I need to tell you something, but I don't want you to worry. What happened? Someone came to my house yesterday. A young man, maybe late 20s, said he was a friend of Sofia's. He wanted to talk about the trust fund, about whether there might be any way to access money for Sofia's medical expenses. My blood ran cold. Grandma, what did you tell him? I told him to leave my property immediately and not come back. But Emma, he knew things. He knew about the construction company, about the sale amount, even about your apartment complex. Someone gave him detailed information about our family. Did you call the police? What would I tell them? A polite young man asked questions about money. They'd think I was a paranoid old woman. Elena's voice gained strength as she continued. But I wanted you to know, because I think Sofia's desperation is making her reach out to people who might not have good intentions. The implications were terrifying. Sofia's social media campaign had attracted thousands of followers, many of whom had expressed violent anger toward me in the comments. If she was now sharing personal information with strangers, my safety could be at risk. I immediately called the Phoenix Police Department's non-emergency line and filed a report about potential harassment and stalking. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic but realistic about their limitations. Without direct threats or evidence of criminal behavior, there's not much we can do preventively, he explained. But having this on record means we can respond more quickly if the situation escalates. How do I know if it's escalating? Unwanted contact, people showing up at your home or workplace, anyone attempting to access your personal information. Document everything, and don't hesitate to call if you feel unsafe. That afternoon, I installed a security system in my apartment and changed my parking space to one not visible from the street. I also informed my supervisor at work about the family situation, just in case Sofia's followers tried to target me professionally. The precautions felt paranoid, until 3 days later, when my apartment complex's management office called to inform me that someone had been asking questions about my lease and attempting to access my rental application information. We didn't give them anything, the manager assured me, but they seem to know a lot about your situation already. They claim to be conducting a background check for a potential employer. What did they look like? Young Hispanic woman. Very pregnant. Said her name was Rodriguez. She got upset when we wouldn't help her, and said something about family members hiding assets. Sofia had come to my home, not to ask for help as she'd claimed in her videos, but to gather information she could use against me. The realization that my own sister was actively trying to intimidate me marked a turning point in how I viewed our relationship. That evening, I called Jennifer Chen, my lawyer, and asked about filing a restraining order. Showing up at your apartment complex isn't automatically grounds for a restraining order, she explained. But combined with the social media harassment and the incident at your grandmother's house, we might have enough to petition for a temporary order of protection. What would that accomplish? It would legally prohibit Sofia from contacting you directly, or through third parties, coming within a certain distance of your home or workplace, and posting about you on social media. Violating the order would be a criminal offense. And the downside, it would make the family conflict very public and very official. Are you prepared for that level of escalation? I thought about Grandpa Tony, About his belief that sometimes you have to fight for what you've earned. About Grandma Elena facing down a stranger at her front door. About the trust fund that represented not just money, but a test of whether I would defend the values that had earned it. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Sofia's behavior suggested she somehow knew legal action was coming. Her social media posts became increasingly erratic, alternating between tearful pleas for family reconciliation and angry rants about rich people who think they can silence the truth with lawyers. More concerning were the private messages I started receiving from her followers. Most were simply mean-spirited insults, but a few contained specific threats about teaching me a lesson or showing me what real hardship looks like. I forwarded everything to both my lawyer and the police, building a paper trail that would support the restraining order. The most disturbing development came when my employer's HR department contacted me about concerning communications they'd received regarding my character and fitness for employment. Someone had sent anonymous emails, claiming I was under investigation for financial crimes, and suggesting the company should reconsider my position. We know these allegations are baseless, my supervisor assured me. But we wanted you to be aware that someone is actively trying to damage your professional reputation. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clear. Sofia wasn't just running a social media campaign. She was trying to destroy every aspect of my life that provided stability and security. If she couldn't have my money, she seemed determined to ensure I couldn't enjoy it either. The night before the restraining order hearing, I received a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Emma? It was Sofia, her voice small and scared in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. Sofia, you're not supposed to contact me directly. My lawyer told your lawyer. Please, just listen for 1 minute. I'm scared, Emma. Really scared. Despite everything, hearing genuine fear in my sister's voice triggered my protective instincts. What's wrong? Some of the people who've been supporting me online, they're not just angry at you. They're angry at the whole situation, and they're starting to blame me for not being aggressive enough. Her voice cracked. One guy said if I wasn't going to handle my business, maybe he would handle it for me. Sofia, you need to go to the police and tell them what? That I created a social media mob, and now they're turning on me too. She started crying. Emma, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to get this dangerous. I just wanted things to be fair. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sisterly bond. The urge to protect Sofia from consequences she hadn't fully understood. But then I remembered the stranger at Grandma Elena's house, the harassment at my workplace, the months of psychological warfare, designed to pressure me into giving up my inheritance. Sofia, if you're genuinely scared, I'll help you contact the police and make a report. But I'm not dropping the restraining order, and I'm not giving you money to make this go away. But if you just helped me pay off some of the debt, I could make the social media stuff stop. I could tell everyone we worked things out. And there it was. Even in her fear, even facing potential danger from the mob she'd created, Sofia's instinct was still to negotiate for money. The scared little sister voice was just another manipulation tactic. One more way to try to extract what she wanted from the situation. Sofia, the hearing is tomorrow morning. If you want to discuss safety concerns, you can bring them up with the judge. But this conversation is over. I hung up and immediately called my lawyer to report the contact. Jennifer Chen's response was exactly what I expected. That call probably just guaranteed we'll get the restraining order. Contacting you directly, after being explicitly told not to, shows a pattern of boundary violation that judges take very seriously. And if she's really in danger from her own supporters, that's a separate issue from whether she should be allowed to harass you. One problem doesn't solve the other. The next morning, I dressed carefully for court in a navy blue suit that projected professional competence without appearing flashy. I wanted Judge Williams to see someone who took legal proceedings seriously, someone worthy of the protection I was seeking. Sofia arrived at the courthouse with our parents and a different lawyer, a woman named Patricia Morales, who specialized in family law and victim advocacy. Sofia had dressed to emphasize her pregnancy, wearing a loose white dress that made her look young and vulnerable. The hearing began with my lawyer presenting evidence of Sofia's harassment campaign, screenshots of social media posts, documentation of the stranger visiting Grandma Elena, records of the inquiries at my apartment complex and workplace. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Sofia's lawyer argued that my petition was an attempt to silence a pregnant woman's plea for help, and that the social media posts were protected speech about family dynamics. She suggested that any third-party harassment was beyond Sofia's control and shouldn't be attributed to her. But Judge Williams focused on the direct actions Sofia had taken, particularly the visit to my apartment complex and the phone call the night before. Sofia Rodriguez. The judge said, "Do you dispute that you went to your sister's residential complex and attempted to access her personal information?" Sofia looked at her lawyer, who nodded encouragingly. "Your Honor, I was just trying to understand why my sister was hiding from me. Family should be able to talk to family. And do you dispute that you called your sister last night, after being instructed by counsel not to make direct contact? I was scared and needed help. She's my sister." Judge Williams leaned back in her chair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as her tell, when she was about to make a definitive ruling. "Miss Rodriguez, this court understands that you're facing personal difficulties, and we're sympathetic to your situation as an expectant mother. However, your sister's financial decisions, regardless of how they affect you, do not give you the right to harass her, intrude on her privacy, or encourage others to target her." She continued, "The evidence shows a clear pattern of escalating behavior designed to pressure Miss Emma Rodriguez into changing her financial decisions, through intimidation rather than persuasion. This court will not allow family relationships to be weaponized in service of financial demands." The temporary restraining order was granted for 6 months, with the possibility of extension if violations occurred. Sofia was prohibited from contacting me directly, or through intermediaries, coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace, and posting about me on social media platforms. As we left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The legal protection was necessary, but it also meant that my relationship with Sofia had crossed a line from which it might never return. The sister I'd grown up with, however flawed and entitled, had become someone willing to put me in danger to get what she wanted. Walking to my car in the courthouse parking garage, I noticed Sofia and our parents having what appeared to be a heated discussion near their vehicle. Mom was gesturing frantically, while Dad stood with his arms crossed, his posture rigid with anger. Sofia was crying again, but this time her tears looked different, somehow less performative, and more genuinely distressed. For just a moment, I considered approaching them, offering some kind of olive branch that might de-escalate the situation. But then I remembered Grandpa Tony's words about the difference between kindness and enabling, between helping someone and allowing them to avoid consequences. Sofia had made her choices. Now she would have to live with them, just like everyone else. As I drove home through the Phoenix afternoon heat, I thought about the months of psychological warfare that had led to this point. My family had tried to use guilt, manipulation, legal pressure, and ultimately intimidation to force me to give up an inheritance I'd legally and morally earned. They'd turned what should have been a celebration of Grandpa Tony's generosity into a battleground over entitlement versus responsibility. But they'd failed. The money was still mine, the courts had validated my position, and I'd established legal boundaries that would protect me from further harassment. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could defend what I'd earned without compromising my values or caving to pressure. The real test, I realized, wasn't inheriting the money. It was proving I deserved to keep it. And that test was finally over. The restraining order should have marked the end of Sofia's campaign against me, but instead it triggered a new phase of family warfare that revealed just how deep the dysfunction ran in the Rodriguez household. Within 24 hours of Judge Williams granting the protective order, I discovered that my parents had interpreted the court's decision not as a validation of my boundaries, but as a declaration of war against their family's honor. The first sign came when my work phone rang at 8 in the morning, 2 days after the hearing. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which immediately violated the restraining order's provision against contact through intermediaries. But when I answered, expecting to document another violation from my lawyer, I heard my father's voice instead. "Emma, this is Miguel Rodriguez, calling on behalf of Rodriguez Landscaping. We need to discuss the cancellation of your account." The formality was jarring. Dad had never called me by my full name in my life, and we'd never had any kind of business relationship that would require an account. But as he continued speaking, his meaning became clear. Effective immediately, Rodriguez Landscaping will no longer be providing services to Emma Rodriguez or any associated properties. Furthermore, we'll be notifying our business partners about this decision and the circumstances that led to it. "Dad, what are you talking about? You don't do landscaping for me." We're also informing our extended network about recent family developments that have come to our attention. Business relationships are built on trust and character, and we want to ensure our associates understand the kind of person they might be dealing with. The threat was barely disguised. My parents owned one of the most successful landscaping companies in Scottsdale, with contracts throughout the valley's wealthiest neighborhood. They networked with contractors, realtors, property managers, and business owners across Phoenix. Dad was essentially threatening to blacklist me professionally throughout the local business community. "You're going to destroy my reputation because I won't give Sofia money. We're going to tell the truth about what kind of daughter you've become. What people do with that information is up to them." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. My parents had escalated from legal pressure to professional sabotage, apparently believing that if they couldn't force me to share the inheritance, they could at least make me regret keeping it. I immediately forwarded the call details to Jennifer Chen, who confirmed that using family business resources to retaliate against me could constitute additional harassment under the restraining order. But the damage was already beginning. That afternoon, I received a call from my real estate agent Sandra Kim, who had helped me start looking for houses now that I could afford a down payment. "Emma, I need to ask you about something awkward. I got a call today from Miguel Rodriguez about your character and financial situation. He suggested there might be some kind of fraud investigation involving you, and warned me to be careful about doing business with you." My stomach dropped. "Sandra, there's no fraud investigation. This is family retaliation over an inheritance dispute." I figured as much, honestly. "Your financial documentation is solid, and you've been nothing but professional with me. But I wanted you to know that someone is actively trying to sabotage your house hunting process. Has this affected other agents?" Sandra hesitated. "Miguel Rodriguez has a lot of connections in real estate. If he's making calls like this to other agents, it could make finding representation more difficult." The systematic nature of my parents' campaign became apparent over the following week, as I received similar calls from my car insurance agent, my dentist's office, and even the manager of my gym. In each case, someone identifying themselves as a concerned family member had called to suggest that I was under investigation for financial crimes and might not be a reliable client. Most professionals dismissed these calls as obvious family drama, but the mere fact that I had to repeatedly explain and defend myself was exhausting. More troubling was the realization that my parents were willing to lie about criminal investigations to damage my reputation, crossing lines I hadn't thought they would cross. The campaign extended beyond professional sabotage. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria, emboldened by the restraining order hearing, launched their own offensive designed to isolate me from extended family and family friends. Their strategy was more subtle than Sofia's social media blitz, but potentially more damaging in the long term. They hosted a family barbecue the weekend after the restraining order was granted, inviting everyone in our extended network except me and Grandma Elena. According to my cousin Diego, who called to warn me, the gathering was essentially a trial in absentia, where Carlos presented his case against my character to anyone who would listen. They set up a whole presentation, Emma. Photos of Sofia looking pregnant and sad. Printouts of the court documents, even a timeline of events that made you look like some kind of master manipulator who had been planning to steal the inheritance for years. What did people say? It was mixed. Some of the older relatives bought into it completely, especially the ones who remembered you as the quiet, studious kid who always seemed too serious. But others pushed back, particularly Tia Rosa and Primo Fernando. They remembered how hard you worked and how often Sofia got bailed out of trouble. Diego described a family gathering that had devolved into arguments about fairness, responsibility, and what constituted appropriate family loyalty. By the end of the evening, the Rodriguez extended family had effectively split into two camps: those who believed I owed Sofia financial support regardless of legal technicalities, and those who believed inheritance decisions should be respected regardless of personal feelings about the outcome. "The worst part," Diego continued, "was hearing Carlos talk about you like you were some kind of stranger who had infiltrated the family. He kept saying things like, 'This isn't the Emma we raised and money changes people.' Like you hadn't been exactly the same person your whole life." The family schism deepened when Aunt Rosa, Dad's sister who had always been close to Grandpa Tony, decided to publicly challenge Carlos's narrative. Rosa worked as a social worker and had spent her career dealing with family dynamics and financial manipulation. Her professional experience gave her perspective that other relatives lacked. Rosa called me directly, violating the informal family boycott that Carlos and Maria had tried to establish. Emma, I want you to know that not everyone is buying into this nonsense. Your grandfather was a smart man who made his decision for good reasons. I've seen too many families destroyed by people who think need creates entitlement. Tia Rosa, I appreciate that, but I don't want you to get caught in the middle of this. Mija, I'm not in the middle. I'm on the side of what's right, and what's right is respecting a dead man's wishes, instead of trying to guilt-trip his chosen beneficiary into changing them. Rosa's support came with valuable intelligence about the family's internal dynamics. She revealed that Sofia's debt problems were actually much worse than anyone had admitted publicly. The $45,000 in credit card debt was just the beginning. Sofia had also taken out personal loans, borrowed money from friends, and
even used Grandma Elena's credit card without permission to fund her lifestyle and failed business ventures. Your parents have been covering for her for years, Rosa explained. They paid off her first round of credit cards, co-signed for her car loan, even gave her money for that ridiculous jewelry business she tried to start. They're not just enabling her, they're drowning trying to keep her afloat. This context reframed their legal campaign against me. It wasn't just about Sofia needing money, it was about my parents desperately trying to find a solution for a financial black hole that threatened to consume their own retirement savings. My inheritance represented not just help for Sofia, but relief for Miguel and Carmen from the endless cycle of bailouts they'd been providing. Understanding their motivation didn't make their tactics more acceptable, but it explained the intensity of their efforts. They weren't just fighting for Sofia's financial security, they were fighting for their own. The family warfare reached a crescendo when Sofia herself violated the restraining order in the most public way possible. 3 weeks after the court hearing, she showed up at my workplace during lunch hour, positioning herself in the parking lot where she could be seen by anyone entering or leaving the building. She didn't approach me directly or try to engage in conversation, technically staying within the letter of the restraining order's distance requirements. Instead, she held a handmade sign that read "My sister chose money over family," and staged what appeared to be a one-woman protest outside the office building. The spectacle was carefully orchestrated for maximum embarrassment. Sofia had timed her appearance to coincide with the lunch rush when most employees would be coming and going. She'd positioned herself near the main entrance where she couldn't be missed. And she'd dressed to emphasize her pregnancy, wearing a tight shirt that accentuated her now prominent belly. My coworkers' reactions were exactly what Sofia had anticipated. Confusion, awkwardness, and a few pointed questions about what kind of family drama I was involved in. My supervisor, Tom Martinez, called me into his office within an hour of Sofia's arrival. "Emma, I understand you're dealing with a personal situation, but we can't have protesters outside our building. It's disruptive to business and makes clients uncomfortable." "Tom, she's not my employee or representative. I have a restraining order against her specifically to prevent this kind of behavior." "I get that, but from a practical standpoint, she's here because of you. What's it going to take to make this stop?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Tom wasn't explicitly threatening my job, but he was making it clear that my family drama was becoming a professional liability. If Sofia could disrupt my workplace whenever she wanted, how long would my employer tolerate the inconvenience? I called the police to report the restraining order violation, but their response was frustratingly bureaucratic. The officer who arrived explained that since Sofia hadn't technically approached me or attempted direct contact, her protest fell into a legal gray area. "She's exercising her right to free speech in a public space," he explained. "Unless she makes direct threats or attempts physical contact, there's not much we can do. But the restraining order specifically prohibits harassment. And harassment usually requires direct interaction or clear intent to intimidate. Standing in a parking lot with a sign is closer to picketing than harassment." Sofia maintained her protest for 3 hours before leaving, just long enough to ensure that every employee in the building was aware of our family conflict. The message was clear: the restraining order might prevent her from contacting me directly, but it couldn't stop her from making my life uncomfortable in creative ways. That evening, I received a call from Jennifer Chen with updates on our options for addressing the escalating harassment. The workplace protest probably doesn't constitute a clear violation of the restraining order, but combined with your parents' professional sabotage campaign, we might have grounds for expanding the order to include them as well. Can we do that? It's complicated. They're not directly violating the existing order since they're not prohibited from contacting you. But if we can demonstrate that they're coordinating with Sofia to circumvent the order's intent, we might be able to get a broader injunction. What would that require? Documentation of their campaign, evidence of coordination with Sofia, and proof that their actions constitute harassment rather than legitimate business decisions. It's a higher bar to meet, but not impossible. We agreed to start building a case against my parents, while simultaneously documenting any future violations by Sofia. But even as we planned our legal strategy, I was beginning to understand that the courts could only do so much to protect me from a family determined to make my life miserable. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Grandma Elena, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the ordeal, finally reached her breaking point when she learned about Sofia's workplace protest. Elena Rodriguez had spent 67 years managing family dynamics with diplomacy and grace, smoothing over conflicts and maintaining relationships even when individual family members behaved badly. But her husband's granddaughter being harassed over money he had specifically left for her education and security was apparently the limit of what she would tolerate. Elena called a family meeting for the following Sunday, extending invitations to every adult member of the Rodriguez family. The invitation was formal, written on her personal stationery, and included a line that guaranteed attendance. We will be discussing Antonio's wishes regarding the trust fund and the family's behavior in response to those wishes. Grandpa Tony's name still carried weight in the family, even 2 years after his death. Elena had never used his memory as leverage before, which made her decision to do so now particularly significant. Everyone understood that this wasn't just a family meeting, it was a reckoning. The gathering was held at Elena's house in Central Phoenix, the same modest ranch-style home where she and Tony had raised their children and hosted decades of family celebrations. I arrived early to help Elena prepare, though she seemed surprisingly calm for someone about to confront her entire family. Mija, your grandfather used to say that sometimes you have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your integrity. I've been keeping the peace for too long. The other family members arrived in clusters, with obvious tension visible in their body language and seating choices. Sofia came with my parents, her pregnancy now unmistakable at 6 months. Uncle Carlos and Aunt Maria sat separately, flanked by their adult children, who looked uncomfortable about being caught in the middle of the conflict. Aunt Rosa arrived alone but positioned herself near Elena, signaling her allegiance. Elena began the meeting by placing a framed photo of Grandpa Tony on the coffee table, surrounded by documents I recognized as copies of his will and trust paperwork. Antonio spent 45 years building Rodriguez Construction, she began, her voice steady and clear. He started with nothing but determination and a pickup truck. He worked 7 days a week, missed family vacations, turned down opportunities to relax or retire early, all to build something that would take care of his family after he was gone. She continued, when he sold the business, he could have divided the money equally among all his grandchildren. He could have left it to his children, he could have donated it to charity. But he didn't do any of those things. He left it specifically to Emma, because he believed she embodied the values that built the wealth in the first place. Sofia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Elena wasn't finished. For 6 months, I've watched this family tear itself apart trying to overturn Antonio's decision. I've watched my granddaughter be sued, harassed, threatened, and publicly humiliated because she had the audacity to accept a gift her grandfather wanted her to have. And I've watched some of you enable and encourage this behavior, because you think family loyalty means everyone gets the same thing regardless of what they've earned. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and Sofia's occasional sniffles. Elena picked up a folder from the side table and opened it slowly. These are copies of every check Antonio wrote to help family members over the last 10 years of his life. Sofia, he bailed you out of debt 3 times for a total of $18,000. Miguel, he lent you money for equipment purchases that were never repaid. Carlos, he helped cover your son's medical bills when Diego broke his leg. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person as she continued. Emma never asked him for money. Not once. She worked her way through college, found her own apartment, bought her own car, built her own life. The trust fund wasn't a gift to his favorite granddaughter. It was a reward for the granddaughter who proved she didn't need rescuing. Dad finally spoke up, his voice defensive. Mom, this isn't about favoritism. This is about family taking care of family. No, Miguel, this is about some family members expecting others to solve their problems while contributing nothing themselves. Sofia has been out of college for 3 years. What has she built? What has she contributed? What has she done to earn a share of money she didn't work for? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable.
Elena continued her devastating critique. And you, Miguel and Carmen, instead of teaching your daughter responsibility, you've taught her that someone else will always fix her mistakes. Instead of being proud that one daughter proved she could succeed independently, you're angry that she won't subsidize the other daughter's continued dependence. Mom tried to interrupt, but Elena held up a hand to stop her. I'm not finished. For 6 months, you've turned family gatherings into manipulation sessions. You've tried to use the courts to steal money that doesn't belong to you. You've launched campaigns to destroy Emma's reputation and professional relationships. You've encouraged your daughter to violate court orders and engage in public harassment. And through it all, you've acted like Emma is the problem for not giving in to your demands. Elena stood up, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. This ends today. Emma will not be pressured, guilted, manipulated, or threatened into giving away her inheritance. Anyone who continues to participate in that kind of behavior will not be welcome in my home or at family gatherings I host. Antonio's decision is final, and anyone who can't respect that is disrespecting his memory. She looked directly at Sofia. And you, young lady, are going to stop this ridiculous harassment campaign immediately. Your grandfather loved you, but he didn't leave you money because he knew you hadn't earned it. Instead of trying to steal what your sister earned, you need to figure out how to build something for yourself and your child. The silence that followed Elena's speech was profound. No one seemed to know how to respond to such a direct confrontation from the family's traditional peacekeeper. Finally, Carlos spoke up, his voice tight with anger. So that's it. Emma gets everything, and the rest of us get lectures about worthiness. The rest of you get exactly what Antonio intended for you to get. Elena replied calmly. The difference is that Emma accepted her inheritance gracefully, while some of you have spent months proving you didn't deserve it. The meeting effectively ended there, with family members filing out in uncomfortable silence. Sofia left crying, supported by my parents who looked shell-shocked by Elena's unexpected assertiveness. Carlos and Maria departed without saying goodbye, their anger radiating like heat. Only Aunt Rosa and her family stayed behind to help clean up, and Rosa's assessment of the situation was blunt. Elena just saved this family from destroying itself completely. It needed to be said, even if it was painful to hear. That evening, as I sat in Elena's kitchen helping her wash coffee cups and put away folding chairs, she shared something that recontextualized everything I thought I knew about Grandpa Tony's decision. Mija, there's something I never told you about the trust fund. Your grandfather didn't just decide to leave you the money because you were responsible. He specifically wanted to test whether you would defend it when challenged. What do you mean? He knew that Sofia would feel entitled to a share. He knew your parents would pressure you to give her money. He knew the family would try to guilt you into changing his decision. The trust fund wasn't just an inheritance, it was a final lesson about standing up for what you've earned even when people you love try to take it away. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. He would be so proud of how you've handled this. Not just because you kept the money, but because you proved you understood why he gave it to you in the first place. As I drove home that night through the desert darkness, I reflected on the months of family warfare that had followed my 28th birthday. The legal battles, the harassment campaigns, the professional sabotage, the public humiliation. All of it had been a test, not just of my resolve, but of my character. Sofia had failed that test spectacularly, proving through her actions exactly why Grandpa Tony hadn't trusted her with financial responsibility. My parents had failed it too, choosing manipulation over respect for his wishes. Even some of my extended family had failed it, prioritizing perceived fairness over actual justice. But I had passed it. Not perfectly, not without moments of doubt and pain, but ultimately successfully. I had defended what I'd earned, maintained my boundaries, and refused to let guilt override my grandfather's explicit intentions. The trust fund was still mine, legally and morally. But more importantly, I had proven I deserved to keep it. The war was finally over, and I had won. Grandma Elena's intervention marked the beginning of what I came to think of as the Great Sorting, a process where each family member revealed their true character by how they responded to her ultimatum. The weeks following her decisive confrontation were like watching dominoes fall, each person's choice creating ripple effects that would reshape our family permanently. The first to crack was Uncle Carlos. 3 days after Elena's meeting, he showed up at her house with what he clearly believed was an olive branch, but was actually a transparent attempt at manipulation. Elena called me immediately after he left, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disappointment. He came here with flowers and apologies, acting like he wanted to make peace, she told me. But then he started asking about your plans for the money, suggesting that maybe we could all work together to find a solution that helped everyone. What did you tell him? I told him that Antonio's will wasn't a group project, and that his granddaughter's inheritance wasn't up for committee review. Then I told him to leave, and not come back until he was ready to accept reality. Carlos's failed diplomatic mission apparently convinced him that Elena was no longer a viable ally in his campaign against me. Within the week, he and Aunt Maria had launched their own version of Sofia's social media strategy, but targeted specifically at the extended family and family friends who had remained neutral during the earlier conflicts. Their approach was more sophisticated than Sofia's emotional appeals. Instead of positioning themselves as victims, they presented themselves as concerned family elders worried about the precedent my inheritance set for future generations. They organized coffee meetings with older relatives, hosted intimate dinners, where they could control the conversation, and systematically reached out to family friends with carefully crafted versions of events. The central narrative they promoted was that Elena had been manipulated by grief into supporting my selfish decision, and that honoring Antonio's will was less important than maintaining family unity. They suggested that my refusal to share the inheritance was tearing apart a family that had been close-knit for generations, and that compromise was still possible if enough people pressured me to be reasonable. For several weeks, this strategy seemed to be working. I started receiving calls and visits from relatives I barely knew, all delivering variations of the same message. Family harmony was more important than money, and I had the power to fix everything by simply doing the right thing. The most painful of these interventions came from my godmother, Patricia Ruiz, who had been close friends with my mother since childhood. Patricia had always been a peripheral figure in my life, someone who sent birthday cards and attended major family events, but wasn't involved in day-to-day relationships. Her sudden interest in my financial decisions felt intrusive and inappropriate. "Emma Misha, I've known your family since before you were born," she said, during an unannounced visit to my apartment. "Your mother is heartbroken about this situation. She feels like she's lost both daughters, one to debt and desperation, the other to greed and stubbornness. Patricia, with respect, this isn't about greed, this is about respecting my grandfather's wishes. But your grandfather is gone, and your living family is suffering. Sofia is going to have a baby in 3 months. She has no stable income, no savings, no partner to help support the child. You have the power to change that." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Patricia alternating between emotional manipulation and rational arguments about family responsibility. She painted a picture of Sofia as a young woman who had made mistakes but deserved another chance, and portrayed me as someone who had the luxury of financial security and should use it to help less fortunate family members. What struck me most about Patricia's visit wasn't her arguments, which I'd heard countless variations of over the past months, but her obvious coaching. She used specific phrases that matched Carlos and Maria's talking points, referenced details about the family conflict that she couldn't have known firsthand, and seemed to be following a script designed to hit particular emotional triggers. The realization that my extended family was being systematically recruited and coached to pressure me was both infuriating and enlightening. It confirmed that Carlos and Maria weren't just expressing personal opinions, they were running a coordinated campaign designed to isolate me from family support and force me into capitulation through social pressure. But their strategy had a fatal flaw. The same relatives who were initially swayed by their appeals for family unity began to grow uncomfortable as the pressure campaign intensified. People who had agreed to make one phone call or have one conversation with me found themselves being asked to escalate their involvement in ways that felt inappropriate. The turning point came when Carlos approached my cousin Fernando, Aunt Rosa's eldest son, and asked him to organize a family intervention, where multiple relatives would confront me simultaneously about my selfishness. Fernando, who worked as a therapist and understood the psychology of family manipulation, was appalled by the suggestion. Fernando called me immediately after Carlos left his house. "Emma, I need to warn you about what's happening. Carlos is trying to organize some kind of ambush intervention, where multiple family members would gang up on you about the inheritance." When I refused to participate, he got angry and said that people who weren't willing to help solve the family crisis were part of the problem. "How many people has he approached?" From what I can tell, at least 8 or 10 relatives plus several family friends. Some said yes initially, but I think people are starting to realize how manipulative this whole thing is. Fernando's warning proved accurate. Over the following week, I received apologetic calls from 3 different relatives who had initially agreed to participate in Carlos's intervention, but changed their minds after thinking about it more carefully. I realized that ganging up on you wasn't going to solve anything, explained my second cousin Rosa Elena. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Carlos was asking us to help him bully you into giving away money that your grandfather specifically wanted you to have. The failed intervention attempt marked the beginning of Carlos and Maria's isolation from the broader family network. Their increasingly aggressive tactics had backfired, turning neutral relatives into active opponents of their campaign. Even family members who had initial sympathy for Sofia began to distance themselves from the manipulative pressure tactics being used to support her. Meanwhile, Sofia herself seemed to be undergoing her own transformation, though it was difficult to tell whether her changes were genuine or simply another strategic pivot. 6 weeks after Elena's ultimatum, Sofia made an announcement on her social media that surprised everyone. "I've decided to take a break from social media to focus on preparing for motherhood and getting my life together," she posted. "I realize that some of my recent posts about family issues were inappropriate and hurtful. I'm sorry for any drama I've caused, and ask for privacy during this time." The post was remarkably mature and self-aware compared to her previous content, leading some family members to hope that pregnancy had finally motivated Sofia to grow up and take responsibility for her situation. But others, including Elena and me, remained skeptical about whether this represented genuine change or tactical retreat. Our skepticism proved justified when Diego called me with updates about Sofia's actual behavior behind the scenes. According to his sources, Sofia had deleted her social media accounts not out of newfound maturity, but because she'd been served with a cease and desist letter from my lawyer regarding her continued violations of the restraining order through online harassment. "She's not getting her life together," Diego reported. "She's just gotten better at hiding her problems. She's still living with your parents, still not working, still accumulating debt. The only thing that's changed is that she's not broadcasting it publicly anymore." More troubling were reports that Sofia had been reaching out to online fundraising platforms and victim advocacy organizations, shopping a carefully edited version of her story, to see if she could generate financial support from strangers who wouldn't know the full context of the family conflict. She's been contacting organizations that help pregnant women in crisis situations, Diego explained, painting herself as someone who was cut off from family support because she got pregnant out of wedlock. She's not mentioning the inheritance, or the lawsuit, or any of the harassment she's done. The revelation that Sofia was essentially running charity scams based on fabricated versions of her circumstances was the final straw for several family members who had maintained sympathy for her despite her previous behavior. When word of her deceptive fundraising attempts spread through the family network, even some of her strongest supporters began to question whether they had misjudged the situation. The most significant defection came from my parents themselves. 8 weeks after Elena's ultimatum, I received an unexpected call from my mother, her voice strained in a way that suggested she was calling against her better judgment. "Emma, we need to talk. Not about money," she added quickly, when she heard me start to object. "About Sofia." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Tempe, that was public enough to prevent any dramatic confrontations, but quiet enough for a serious conversation. Mom arrived looking exhausted, older than I remembered, with the kind of weariness that suggested months of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Sofia is out of control," she said without preamble. "The pregnancy was supposed to mature her, motivate her to get her life together. Instead, she's gotten worse. She lies constantly, manipulates everyone around her, and refuses to take any responsibility for her situation." "Mom, I know this is hard, but let me finish," she interrupted. "Your father and I have been enabling her for years. We told ourselves we were helping her through a difficult time, giving her the support she needed to find her direction. But we weren't helping her. We were teaching her that other people would always solve her problems." The admission was more honest than any conversation we'd had since the inheritance drama began. Mom continued, describing months of escalating problems with Sofia that had been hidden from the rest of the family. Sofia had been stealing from their house, taking small items that could be pawned or sold online. She'd been using their credit cards, without permission, for purchases she claimed were baby-related, but were actually for her own wants. Most seriously, she'd been bringing strangers to the house, people she'd met online, who were supposedly willing to help with her financial problems, but who made my parents feel unsafe in their own home. One of them was asking questions about your apartment, about where you work, about your daily routine. Mom said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. When I asked Sofia why this man needed to know about you, she said he was a friend who wanted to help mediate the family conflict. The implication was chilling. Sofia had apparently been providing personal information about me to strangers she'd met through her online harassment campaign, potentially putting my safety at risk in ways that went far beyond her previous stalking and workplace protests. Mom, did you report this to the police? We told Sofia she had to stop bringing strangers to the house, but she said we were being paranoid. She claimed all her online friends were just concerned supporters who wanted to help her get justice. Mom paused, gathering courage for what came next. Emma, I think your sister is having some kind of mental health crisis. The pregnancy, the stress, the financial pressure, it's all combined to create someone I don't recognize anymore. The conversation marked a fundamental shift in my parents' understanding of the family dynamic. For the first time since the inheritance conflict began, they were acknowledging that Sofia's problems went deeper than financial hardship, and that my refusal to enable her might actually be the healthiest response to her increasingly erratic behavior. We're going to ask her to move out, Mom continued. Not because we don't love her, but because we can't help her by continuing to shield her from consequences. She needs professional help, and as long as we're providing her with free housing and financial support, she has no incentive to get it. What about the baby? We've contacted social services about resources for pregnant women in crisis situations. There are programs that can help her with housing, job training, and parenting classes if she's willing to participate. But she has to want help with the underlying problems, not just want money to continue avoiding them. The conversation ended with something that felt almost like an apology, though my mother never used the word directly. Emma, we were wrong to pressure you about the inheritance. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he made his decision, and we should have respected that from the beginning. We let our love for Sofia cloud our judgment about what was actually best for her and for the family. 2 weeks later, Sofia moved out of my parents' house, under circumstances that remained unclear. According to Diego's updates, there had been a major confrontation involving the police, child protective services, and an ambulance, but the details were kept private even within the family. What was clear was that Sofia had entered some kind of residential program for pregnant women with substance abuse and mental health issues. The program provided housing, medical care, and counseling in exchange for participation in therapy and life skills training. For the first time in months, Sofia was in an environment where her manipulation tactics didn't work, where her emotional appeals fell on professionally trained ears, and where her survival depended on genuine change rather than finding new people to rescue her. The program also provided me with something I hadn't expected: peace of mind about Sofia's safety and the baby's health. Whatever problems she was facing, she was finally getting appropriate professional help, instead of relying on family members who were too emotionally invested to provide effective support. Christmas that year was smaller than usual, with many extended family members choosing to
skip the traditional Rodriguez gathering rather than navigate the post-conflict dynamics. But for those who did attend Elena's celebration, there was a sense of relief and authenticity that had been missing from family events for years. Carlos and Maria hosted their own separate celebration, apparently hoping to create a rival gathering that would demonstrate their continued influence within the family. According to reports from relatives who attended both events, their party was awkward and tense, dominated by complaints about family disloyalty and barely disguised attempts to recruit allies for future campaigns against me. Meanwhile, Elena's celebration felt genuinely festive for the first time since Grandpa Tony's death. Without the undercurrent of manipulation and hidden agendas that had poisoned recent gatherings, family members could actually enjoy each other's company. My parents attended Elena's party, though they remained somewhat distant and formal in their interactions with me. The months of conflict had damaged our relationship in ways that would take time to repair, but their presence felt like a first step toward eventual reconciliation. The most meaningful moment of the evening came when Elena pulled me aside to share an update about Sofia's situation. She's been in the program for 6 weeks now, Elena said. The counselors say she's making progress, but it's slow going. Apparently, she's had to confront some difficult truths about her behavior and her expectations. Has she asked about me? Not directly, but she did ask whether you would ever be willing to have a relationship with her again, someday in the future if she got her life together. Elena paused. I told her that forgiveness was possible, but it would have to be earned through changed behavior, not just promised through words. 3 months later, I received a letter in the mail with Sofia's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a 2-page handwritten note that was unlike anything I'd ever received from my sister. Emma, it began, I know I have no right to contact you after everything I've done, and I'm not asking for anything except the chance to apologize properly. The letter continued with a detailed acknowledgement of specific harmful behaviors, from the social media harassment to the workplace protest to the attempts to damage my professional reputation. More importantly, it included something Sofia had never offered before: acceptance of responsibility without excuses or justifications. I spent months telling myself that I deserved your inheritance because I needed it more than you did, she wrote. I convinced myself that Grandpa Tony had been unfair, that you had manipulated him, that the whole family was conspiring against me. But none of that was true. The truth is that I was jealous of your success and angry that you had earned something I wanted but hadn't worked for. The letter concluded with information about her progress in the residential program and her plans for after the baby was born, including job training and continuing therapy. She also included a commitment that surprised me with its specificity and apparent sincerity. I promise that I will never ask you for money, directly or indirectly, for the rest of my life. Not for me, not for my child, not for any emergency or crisis that might come up. I understand now that asking family members to solve problems I should solve myself was one of the main ways I avoided growing up and taking responsibility for my choices. I read the letter 3 times before deciding how to respond. After months of manipulation, threats, and harassment, Sofia's words felt genuine in a way that her previous communications never had. But I also understood that good intentions and sincere apologies didn't automatically erase the damage that had been done or guarantee that the changes would be permanent. I decided to respond with cautious optimism, acknowledging her apology while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Sofia, I wrote back, I appreciate your letter and your acknowledgement of the harm that was done. I'm glad you're getting the help you need and hope you continue making progress. I'm not ready for a full relationship right now, but I'm open to the possibility of rebuilding trust gradually over time, based on consistent changed behavior rather than promises. 6 months later, Sofia gave birth to a healthy daughter she named Isabella Carmen Rodriguez. According to Elena, who was permitted to visit as the baby's great-grandmother, Sofia had successfully completed the residential program and moved into transitional housing where she was working part-time while continuing therapy and parenting classes. The report on Sofia's progress was encouraging, but I remained focused on building my own life rather than monitoring her recovery. Using the inheritance wisely had become my way of honoring both Grandpa Tony's memory and the values that had earned me his trust. I purchased a modest 3-bedroom house in Ahwatukee, paying cash to avoid mortgage payments and leaving myself with substantial savings to invest for long-term security. The house wasn't flashy or expensive by Scottsdale standards, but it was mine completely, with no debt or cosigners or obligations to anyone else. More importantly, I used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund at Arizona State University specifically for first-generation college students studying business or skilled trades. The fund was named the Antonio Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship and included a plaque describing his journey from immigrant laborer to successful business owner. The scholarship represented everything Grandpa Tony had believed in: rewarding hard work, supporting people who were building something rather than expecting something, and creating opportunities for others to achieve the same kind of independence and success he had achieved. A year after the family conflict ended, I received an invitation to Elena's 85th birthday celebration. The guest list was smaller than previous family gatherings, but it included everyone who had ultimately chosen respect for Antonio's wishes over pressure for wealth redistribution. My parents attended, and while our relationship remained somewhat formal and careful, we had achieved a workable peace based on mutual respect rather than the unconditional family loyalty they had previously demanded. They had learned to be proud of my success without expecting to benefit from it financially, and I had learned to maintain loving relationships with people who had disappointed me without compromising my boundaries. Sofia was not invited to the party, but Elena shared updates about her continued progress. She was living independently with Isabella, working full-time as a receptionist at a pediatric clinic, and maintaining her commitment to therapy and financial responsibility. Most significantly, she had never again asked for money from any family member, honoring the promise she had made in her letter to me. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave Elena's house, she asked me to stay behind to help with cleanup, just as we had done after the family meeting that ended the conflict over the inheritance. "Mija," she said as we washed dishes together, "do you think Antonio would be proud of how everything turned out?"
I considered the question carefully before answering. The family had been permanently changed by the conflict over the inheritance. Some relationships had been damaged beyond repair, others had been strengthened through testing, and everyone had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. But ultimately, Grandpa Tony's values had been vindicated. Hard work had been rewarded over entitlement. Personal responsibility had triumphed over emotional manipulation. And the money he had earned through decades of labor was being used to build something lasting rather than simply consumed by immediate wants. Yes, I said finally, I think he would be proud. Not because everything worked out perfectly, but because the people who mattered most learned the lessons he was trying to teach. Elena smiled and handed me a small wrapped package. He wanted me to give you this on your first Christmas after the inheritance, but with all the drama, I waited until I thought you were ready for it. Inside the package was a framed photograph I had never seen before. It showed Grandpa Tony at a construction site, probably sometime in the 1980s, wearing work clothes and a hard hat, his hands dirty from manual labor, but his expression proud and satisfied. On the back in his handwriting was a note for Emma, who understands that anything worth having is worth protecting. Build well, Mija. As I drove home that night through the familiar streets of Phoenix, I reflected on the year that had transformed my understanding of family, money, and personal values. The inheritance had given me financial security, but the fight to keep it had given me something more valuable: absolute certainty about my own worth, and the courage to defend it against any challenge. The trust fund had indeed matured exactly as Grandpa Tony had intended. Not just the money, but the person who received it. And that transformation was the real inheritance, the one that would last long after the dollars were spent or invested or given away. Sofia had laughed at my empty promises in family court, dismissing my potential because I lived modestly and drove an old car. But those choices hadn't been signs of limitation, they had been signs of discipline, the same discipline that built Rodriguez Construction from nothing, and turned an immigrant's work ethic into generational wealth. In the end, the money was just money. But proving I deserved to keep it had made me worthy of everything else I might build in the years to come. 2 years had passed since the family court hearing, where Sofia laughed at what she called my empty promises, and the Arizona desert had cycled through 2 more seasons of scorching summers and mild winters. I was sitting in my home office in Ahwatukee, reviewing the annual report for the Antonio Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship Fund, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emma, this is Sofia. I know we agreed to minimal contact, but something has happened that I thought you should know about. Can we meet for coffee? I promise this isn't about money or favors, it's about family. The message surprised me for several reasons. First, Sofia had meticulously honored her commitment to avoid asking for financial help, even during what Elena had described as genuinely difficult periods in her life. Second, she had respected the boundaries we'd established around communication, reaching out only through Elena, or on major holidays, with brief, appropriate messages. Third, her tone was different, somehow more mature and direct than the manipulative language she'd used during our conflict. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. What kind of family matter? Her reply came quickly. It's about Mom and Dad. They're in trouble, and I think you need to know about it. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in Tempe, neutral territory that held no memories of our previous conflicts. I arrived early and chose a table near the back where we could have privacy without being overheard. Sofia entered exactly on time, and I was struck by how much she had changed physically in the 2 years since I'd seen her. The entitled, dramatic young woman who had staged courthouse protests was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely adult for the first time in her life. She wore simple jeans and a plain sweater, carried herself with quiet confidence rather than performative vulnerability, and when she hugged me, hello, it felt natural rather than calculated. You look good, I said, and meant it. Thanks. Parenthood and therapy will do that. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Isabella keeps me grounded in ways I never expected. We ordered coffee and made small talk about her daughter, now 18 months old and apparently as spirited as her mother had been at that age. Sofia showed me photos on her phone, and for a few minutes we felt like sisters again, sharing the mundane details of daily life without the weight of unresolved conflict. But eventually Sofia's expression grew serious, and she set down her coffee cup with the deliberate gesture of someone preparing to discuss difficult topics. Emma, I need to tell you something about Mom and Dad that they would never tell you themselves. They're going to lose the house. The words hit me like cold water. What do you mean lose the house? Sofia pulled out a folder from her purse and slid it across the table. I've been helping them organize their finances, and the situation is worse than anyone realized. They took out a second mortgage 3 years ago to cover business expenses when the landscaping company was struggling. Then they borrowed against their retirement accounts to pay for my legal fees during the inheritance fight. I opened the folder and saw bank statements, loan documents, and payment schedules that painted a devastating picture of financial decline. My parents, who had always seemed secure and stable, were drowning in debt that they had apparently been hiding from everyone, including each other to some extent. How much do they owe? Between the mortgages, business loans, and credit cards, about $380,000. The landscaping business is barely breaking even, and they're both in their 60s with no real retirement savings left. I studied the documents, trying to process how my parents had gone from successful business owners to the edge of bankruptcy without anyone in the family knowing. The timeline was particularly painful to review, showing how many of their financial decisions had been directly related to the inheritance conflict. Sofia, why are you telling me this? And why now? She leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. Because they got a foreclosure notice last week, and I think they're planning to ask you for help. Not directly, because they're too proud and too ashamed of how they treated you, but through Elena or other family members who don't know the whole story. And you're warning me about this because I don't want you to get manipulated into giving them money out of guilt, the same way I tried to manipulate you. But also because I don't want them to lose everything due to pride and shame, when there might be ways to help that don't involve just throwing money at the problem. Sofia continued, I've been working with a financial counselor as part of my therapy, and she's helped me understand how financial problems are usually symptoms of other issues. Mom and Dad's debt isn't just about business struggles or legal fees. It's about years of making emotional decisions instead of practical ones. She was right, and as I reviewed their financial records, patterns became clear that explained not just their current crisis but some of their behavior during the inheritance fight. They had been living beyond their means for years, using credit and loans to maintain a lifestyle that their business income couldn't actually support. When Sofia's problems created additional expenses, and when the legal battle over my inheritance added more costs, they had simply borrowed more money, rather than making difficult changes. What exactly are you suggesting? Sofia took a deep breath before answering. I think they need professional help, not just money. Financial counseling, business consulting, maybe even therapy to deal with the shame and pride issues that keep them from making rational decisions. And I think that help might be more valuable than a loan that would just enable them to avoid confronting the real problems. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sofia, who had spent years expecting others to solve her financial problems, was now advocating for the kind of tough love approach that I had taken with her inheritance. Her transformation seemed genuine, and her analysis of our parents' situation was more insightful than I would have expected. Have you talked to them about any of this? I tried, but they shut down the conversation immediately. Dad got angry and accused me of being ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. Mom started crying and said they didn't want to burden their children with their problems. Sofia paused. They're so ashamed of the financial mess that they can't think clearly about solutions. We spent another hour discussing options, and I was impressed by Sofia's practical approach to problem solving. She had researched debt consolidation options, investigated business restructuring possibilities, and even looked into resources for older adults facing financial crises. Her suggestions were realistic and well-informed, a far cry from the magical thinking that had characterized her approach to her own problems. As we prepared to leave, Sofia made one more surprising statement. Emma, I want you to know that whatever you decide about helping them, I support it completely. If you think the best thing is to let them face the consequences of their choices, I understand that. If you think there are ways to help that would actually solve problems instead of just postponing them, I'm willing to contribute whatever I can, even though it's not much. You'd be willing to contribute to helping them. I'd be willing to contribute to helping them help themselves, she corrected. I've learned the difference. That evening, I called Elena to ask if she knew about my parents' financial situation. Her response confirmed my suspicion that they had been hiding their problems from the family. I knew something was wrong. Elena said, Your father has been working 7 days a week, and your mother looks exhausted every time I see her. But when I asked if everything was okay, they insisted they were just busy with the business. Grandma, what do you think Grandpa Tony would have wanted me to do in this situation? Elena was quiet for a long moment before answering. Mija, your grandfather believed in helping people who were genuinely trying to help themselves. But he also believed that giving money to people who weren't ready to change just enabled them to keep making the same mistakes. So how do I know which situation this is? You know by what they're willing to do to earn the help. If they're willing to be honest about their mistakes, accept professional guidance, and make real changes to their decision-making, then help might be valuable. If they just want money to continue doing things the same way, then help would be harmful. 2 days later, my father called me directly for the first time since Elena's ultimatum meeting. His voice was strained, and I could hear the humiliation in every word, as he asked if we could meet to discuss a family matter. We met at the same restaurant, where I'd had my difficult conversation with my mother during the height of the inheritance conflict. Dad arrived looking older and more tired than I remembered, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. Emma, I need to tell you something that's very difficult for me to admit, he began. Your mother and I are in serious financial trouble, and it's entirely our own fault. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Dad walked through the timeline of financial decisions that had led to their current crisis, taking full responsibility for choices that had been driven by pride, fear, and poor judgment rather than rational planning. We borrowed money to pay for Sofia's legal fees, because we were convinced that if we could just force you to share the inheritance, everyone's problems would be solved, he admitted. We borrowed money to maintain our lifestyle, because we were embarrassed to admit that the business was struggling. We borrowed money to help Sofia, because we couldn't accept that our enabling was making her problems worse. Dad, why are you telling me this now? Because we got a foreclosure notice, and we've finally run out of ways to avoid dealing with reality. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. I'm not asking you for money, Emma. I know we don't deserve help after how we treated you. But I wanted you to hear the truth from me instead of finding out through family gossip or legal documents. His honesty was unexpected and moving. For the first time since the inheritance conflict began, my father was speaking to me without any hidden agenda or manipulative subtext. He was simply a man who had made serious mistakes and was finally ready to face the consequences. Dad, what would help look like if it were available? Professional guidance, probably. Someone who could help us figure out if the business can be restructured or if we need to sell everything and start over. Maybe debt counseling to help us understand how we got into this mess so we don't repeat the same mistakes. And if that guidance meant making major changes to your lifestyle, then we'd make them. We should have made them years ago, instead of borrowing money to avoid them. The conversation ended with my father expressing genuine remorse for the damage done during the inheritance fight and acknowledging that I had been right to resist family pressure to give away money that wasn't mine to give. Emma, I want you to know that your grandfather would be proud of how you handled that whole situation. You protected his wishes when the rest of us were trying to overturn them, and you showed more integrity than any of us did. After he left, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing the shift in family dynamics that his honesty represented. The proud, controlling father who had tried to sue me for inheritance money was gone, replaced by someone humble enough to admit mistakes and ask for help without demanding it. That weekend, I researched debt counseling services, business restructuring consultants, and financial planning resources for older adults. I also consulted with my own financial advisor about the best ways to help family members without creating dependency or resentment. The solution I developed was structured like the trust fund that had started this whole conflict, help that came with clear expectations and accountability measures. I offered to pay for 6 months of professional financial counseling for my parents, including both personal debt management and business restructuring advice. I also offered to provide a loan that would prevent foreclosure, but only if they completed the counseling program and agreed to ongoing oversight of their financial decisions. The loan would be secured by the business assets and would come with specific terms about lifestyle changes, business operations, and debt management. Most importantly, it would be structured to ensure that my parents learned to solve their own problems, rather than simply having their problems solved for them. My parents accepted the offer with gratitude and humility that felt genuine rather than manipulative. The financial counseling revealed that their business could be profitable if they made some strategic changes and stopped using it as a personal piggy bank. The debt management plan required significant lifestyle adjustments, but offered a realistic path to financial stability. 6 months later, my parents had successfully restructured their business, paid down most of their credit card debt, and developed budgeting skills that prevented them from accumulating new debt. More importantly, they had confronted the pride and shame issues that had driven many of their poor financial decisions. The process also repaired our family relationships in ways that simple time couldn't have accomplished. By working together to solve actual problems rather than just avoiding difficult conversations, we rebuilt trust and respect that had been damaged during the inheritance conflict. Sofia, meanwhile, continued to thrive in her new life as a responsible single mother. She completed a certification program in medical office administration and was promoted to assistant manager at the pediatric clinic where she worked. More significantly, she maintained her commitment to financial independence, never asking for help beyond occasional babysitting from Elena. The most meaningful development was watching Sofia build a genuine relationship with Isabella that was based on stability and consistency, rather than the chaos that had characterized Sofia's own childhood. She had broken the cycle of entitlement and enabling that had shaped her early years, giving her daughter something more valuable than financial security, a mother who solved her own problems. On the 3rd anniversary of the trust fund maturation, Elena organized a small family dinner to celebrate what she called the graduation of the Rodriguez family from financial drama. The guest list included only immediate family members who had successfully completed their own journeys toward financial responsibility and healthy boundaries. During dinner, Elena made a toast that brought tears to my eyes. To Antonio, who knew that the best inheritance isn't money, but the character to handle money wisely. And to his granddaughters, who both learned that lesson, even though they learned it in very different ways. After dinner, Sofia approached me with something she described as a belated birthday gift for the birthday that had started our whole conflict. "I know this seems weird, but I wanted to give you something to mark the day when your real life started," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo of Grandpa Tony and me from my college graduation, a picture I had never seen before. In the photo, I was wearing my cap and gown, holding my diploma, while Grandpa Tony stood beside me with his arm around my shoulders and a proud smile on his face. "I found this in Mom's photo albums while I was helping them organize their papers," Sofia explained. "I thought you should have it because it shows what he saw in you that made him trust you with his legacy." Looking at the photo, I was struck by how young I looked, how uncertain despite my accomplishments. The woman in that picture had no idea what challenges lay ahead, no concept of the family warfare that would test her resolve, no understanding of the strength she would need to defend what she'd earned. But Grandpa Tony had seen something in that uncertain young woman that even she didn't recognize yet. He had seen someone who could handle not just financial responsibility, but the much harder task of protecting that responsibility from people who would try to take it away. The trust fund had matured exactly as he'd intended, not just growing the money, but growing the person worthy of keeping it. And in the end, that transformation had benefited everyone in the family, even those who had initially opposed it. Sofia's laughter in family court about my empty promises seemed like something from another lifetime now. The promises hadn't been empty, they had simply been promises I was making to myself, rather than to her. Promises to honor my grandfather's values, protect what I'd earned, and never let guilt override integrity. Those promises had been kept, and the trust fund had fulfilled its true purpose. Not just providing financial security, but proving that some things are worth fighting for, even when the people you love are the ones trying to take them away. As I drove home that night, through the familiar Phoenix streets, I reflected on how the inheritance had changed everything and nothing. I still lived modestly, still drove carefully, still made decisions based on values, rather than impulses. But now I did those things, from a position of absolute certainty about my own worth, and my right to the fruits of my labor. The money had been important, but the confidence was invaluable. And that confidence would serve me well in whatever challenges lay ahead, long after the last dollar of Grandpa Tony's legacy had been spent, or invested, or given away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.